Welcome to Aquarium 911. This is going to be the first episode of what'll probably be a many episode series where we're going to help people one at a time with their individual problems in their aquariums. So, let's start with our very first problem, some Anubias. This email comes from Zach, and you're going to have to forgive me as I read this, but I think it's important that we read through the email and then we'll find the clues that are telling us where the problems are, and more importantly, the path to fixing them. My issue is my Anubias. I placed them in my quarantine tank while I'm in the process of setting up their permanent tank, along with some Anacris, Kabamba, guppy grass, Bucephalandra, baby tears, and Halanthium. Quite a lot for a 10-gallon tank, I know. They have been in there for about a month so far. Everybody is doing fantastically well, as you can see in one of my photos. The Halanthium is basically a weed. The Anubias, however, is not only melting, but completely falling apart. The leaves are yellowing and being eaten by snails. So this is kind of one of our first clues, right? Not only is it leaves yellowing, but we're seeing the rhizome falling apart. So we're having a kind of deeper issue. It's not just leaf loss, right? We're losing the plant entirely. The snails eating the plant is not necessarily a sign of the snails being a problem. That typically happens as the snails will go through and eat decaying plant matter. They don't usually eat healthy plant matter, so the fact that the snails are actively eating on the leaves tells us, kind of more assuredly, there is something that is causing them to die, and thus snails are using it as food. I assume they were just melting, but the rhizome is deteriorating as well. I dose 1 pump of Easy Green twice a week, because after my Anubias started melting, I assumed the stems were sucking up all the nutrients. Here's my testing parameters. pH 7.5, GH 180 ppm, KH 120 ppm, ammonia 0, nitrite 0, nitrate 40 ppm. I also included a picture of a healthy Anubias non-appetit I have in my main tank. I originally had 4 of them in that tank, but dealt with the same issue. This one is thriving, but his friends all died the same way as those I'm asking you about, aka the leaves and the rhizomes kind of falling apart. Do they just not like my tap water? I'm in Texas, where our water is liquid rock. Thank you, Zach. As we've been talking, we've put up some of the pictures, and pictures will keep coming up as I start describing things, because one of the things I want to look at first is, we see that full tank shot, lots of green, but these are a lot of our easier plants. They're not super demanding, other than they grow fast, so they're going to chew through a lot of nitrates. But when we look at our nitrate testing, we're seeing about 40 ppm. The only question would be, at what point did we test the water between those 2 single pumps? And keep in mind, again, this is a 10-gallon, so we're doing double, right, the dose of what we should be doing. But realistically, when we're dealing with some higher growth plants like stems, twice a week treating it like medium, light level tanks makes a certain amount of sense, right? You got a lot of growth going on, so it makes sense you need a little extra nutrients. If we look at the healthy Anubias non-appetit, granted it's in another tank, but we can see that in general, other than a little bit of some surface algae, which can be kind of common for a lot of Anubias, it's looking fine. We've got good health. We can see those light green newer leaves, and those dark green leaves have an ever so tiny curl to them, but that's not the kind of curl that we'd see as a deficiency. This is just the nature of how those leaves form. If we look at it really, really carefully, what we're seeing is lots of yellowing in the leaf, kind of starting from the center and going outward. But if we notice, the veins are still staying kind of bright green until they fully deteriorate. And this can be a way to point us on the nutrient deficiency that might be going on here. Now, we see a lot of holes in the leaves, and initially yellowing and some holes in the leaves, first thought is almost always potassium. But that might not be the exact case, and let me explain why. Often we'll see the holes form in little spots, and then yellowing slowly kind of expanding from those holes. Instead, if we kind of look at the way these leaves are dealing, they are kind of universally yellow, except for the veins, and then holes are forming kind of in a patchwork all over the place. That leads me to think we've got a significantly different problem. But potassium could be part of the problem. And if we we've got a secondary picture here where we can zoom in a little bit. We see some snails eating it, and we can definitely see like most of this particular leaf is kind of dying out and falling apart. And if we look at this third picture here where you've got them kind of on the right-hand side, again, you see that the leaves are at a state now where kind of everything is yellow. And when everything is yellow, that tells us a number of different things. And then he did mention that the rhizomes are falling apart. Here's a picture of that just to remind you. If we look at the coloration of the rhizome, though, there's quite a bit of green still. It's not going yellow. And there is kind of that Anubias rot that a lot of people are afraid of. Anubias rot often shows in a pale yellow or like brownish yellow coloration occurring on the rhizome. And we're not really seeing a whole lot of that happening here. But it is falling apart, which means something is inherently wrong, but it's not likely to be Anubias rot. Now, I personally have dealt with Anubias problems multiple times as an aquarist. And what I have tended to find is that even in like a tank where I don't have a lot of aggressive growers, like this one that's sitting right here behind me, right? This is mostly crypts and nothing like crazy aggressive growing. I've still dealt with different Anubias rot, and typically, what I have found is it's one of a couple of things. First, if there's too much light and I'm getting too much surface algae, it starts to restrict some of the health of the plants, and over time, they start to fall apart. Or two, I'm dealing with a lot of micronutrient issues, and that's what I think is going on here. And let me explain. If we look at the nutrient deficiency chart, and this specifically is the one for micronutrients, and one of my first things I'm going to suggest to any of you is whenever you're dealing with any problems with your plants, go look up Aquarium Plant Deficiency Chart in Google. And you'll see a bunch of different images. There's one for macronutrients and there's one for micronutrients. These are your two best friends. I regularly consult this chart whenever I'm trying to debug problems, because despite the fact that I've been doing lots of stuff with plants and can identify certain things right away, the visuals of the chart often help me kind of piece the puzzle together a little faster and easier. So do the same thing. So let's think about our clues, right? Yellowing in the leaf, but all of the veins were still kind of green until they finally tear away. And then we get holes, but it's kind of all over the entirety of the leaf. It's not like we got a hole and then it spreads out and yellows from there. It seems like the whole leaf is yellow and it's kind of deteriorating everywhere. My first instinct is a nitrate deficiency when we're looking at something like this. However, we know that we have 40 ppm of nitrate in the tank, and that's testing with all of those stems that are more aggressive growers like the Kabamba and the Nacris in the tank. So we should, in theory, have enough nitrate. And that's where I start thinking, okay, we need to think more about a complex, probably combination of micronutrients. So if we look at this chart, iron is one of the first ones where you see green veins but yellow leaves. So this is kind of similar to what we're dealing with, just we're seeing the deterioration at a slightly later stage where the holes start showing up. However, holes in leaves typically tell us potassium. Well, iron, potassium, we're talking about some of our micronutrients right now. One of the other ones I want to drive your attention to is a magnesium deficiency. Magnesium deficiencies typically look your paleness from the leaf edges. There's not usually spots, and you might have a slight cupping shape, green veins, and they'll start dying in extreme deficiency. But we have 180 TDS of general hardness, which is a combination of calcium and magnesium. So here's where my thoughts are. We could, in that general hardness, have mostly calcium in our water. And this is kind of known for a number of the different rocks and well waters that are in Texas that can be a bit more calcium heavy. They might not necessarily have a really high amount of magnesium, but in general, when we see a GH that's like over 140 ppm, we generally think that we have sufficient amounts of calcium and magnesium available. So one of the other things we would look at is the positioning of the leaves. We're not seeing a big droop, which would be something like copper or calcium deficiencies. We're not seeing like weird curls, anything like that. Again, that kind of leads to copper and mostly calcium deficiencies. We're not seeing it completely shrivel up. That's another deficiency. But one thing we should look at is molybdenum. Funny name. Usually we don't pay very much attention to this one. But if we look at molybdenum on the chart, right? Light yellow leaves, a little bit of green sometimes. But you'll see spots all over the whole leaf except for the stem. See how a couple of these different things combined are speaking to us that this is probably a micronutrient deficiency. So my first thought is this. I don't want to change any lighting. I want to keep our normal schedule that we're running with the Easy Green. However, what I would like to do is supplement micronutrients. My first two options would be something like Brightwell's Florin Multi. And the reason why I like Brightwell's Florin Multi is it is all of the micronutrients plus potassium. And just in case we need an extra little touch of potassium, that can help us get that there. If you can't get a hold of Brightwell Florin Multi, this is where I would start looking at just like Seachem Trace or any other thing that is just your micronutrients. We don't want any nitrates. There's a number of different products out there, but probably the easiest to find is Seachem Trace, right? So Flourish Trace. I know I dog on Flourish, but Trace is actually probably my favorite product that they make. So because it's all the micronutrients, it's readily available, it's easy to find on Amazon and in many, many local fish stores. So I would start dosing Flourish Trace or the Brightwell Florin Multi. I personally like the Florin Multi because it adds the potassium, and it's very hard to get potassium in our water, so very often potassium can be super helpful. However, if you can't find that, it's okay to do Flourish Trace instead, because it does have, it's kind of a touch of everything, just really no potassium. But we don't see anything that is an obvious potassium-only deficiency. This looks like a combination of things, and I think if we buffer all of the trace elements, all of our micronutrients together, we can see some improvement. Now, one of the things we should note is that all those leaves that are having trouble, they're not going to magically recover, right? We're going to be looking at what happens in new growth. But more importantly, because that rhizome is having issues, that kind of leads me to where my second thing is. Magnesium's actually really important for root growth. And that rhizome and a lot of the roots around it are dependent on what most of your other planted, like in the soil type plants would use for their root growth. Now there's a few other things that matter, but magnesium is one of the big ones. And this is where I think, despite the fact that our GH is up there, I think we might be kind of light on magnesium. So how do we add a little magnesium easily? Well, there are magnesium-specific supplements. Flourish line has a magnesium supplement. I don't know that we need a ton, and I would want to start specifically with the trace, because enough of those trace elements being deficient, because all those other really aggressively growing plants are stripping all that trace elements out before really the Anubias has a chance to pull it down. This is my thought process, just because of the plant selection that's in there. That if we supplement the trace elements first, we can probably start to see whether or not the existing rhizome that remains recovers and starts to grow again. What we really want to see, because you've mentioned about moving things to a quarantine tank, is can we get the rhizome and new leaf growth to start occurring? If so, that means we've found our solution, right? We know that all those other faster growing plants are taking up all of the trace elements, and the Anubias is not getting enough of the trace elements. I would look at this for probably somewhere upwards of a month. And I know that sucks because it's a long period of time, but we'll want to be dosing the trace probably once a week, but you might need twice. I would look at the instructions that Seachem gives you on the Flourish bottle. I believe trace is twice a week in their dosing schedule, and you're unlikely to dose so much that it's a problem. But if it is on its own, maybe we only dose once a week, right? So that we're not getting something overabundance, we start dealing with some kind of algae outbreak. If within the first 2 weeks, you still see it rotting back and dying, that's where I would start thinking we need to add magnesium. But if it seems to stop that dieback and it stabilizes, and then from there, within about a month, we see some new growth, that's where I'm going to start saying to myself, okay, we've solved the problem. So after 2 weeks, we're going to look for at least it to stop dying back and kind of stabilize. We might get a new leaf in that period of time. We might see some slight growth. We just need to monitor that very carefully. If we don't see any stabilization, that's where we want to find a small amount of magnesium and add that as well and see after the next 2 weeks if that helps stabilize. If within that month we've stabilized the plant and we start getting new growth, we know the overall solution. From here, it's just a matter of patience. If after a month we don't see any solution to this, this is where I'm going to say, I want you to follow up with me. I know this isn't I'm going to give you a 6-month plan. We want to take this a step at a time, and we want to try not to adjust too many variables at once, because then we don't know which of the variables we've changed is the one that's helping us out. And I'm realizing that this tank's light went off in the middle of this video. Anyway, so that's what I would do. Anytime that I've encountered issues with Anubias, I actually recently have been dealing with some here, and I've kind of got it stabilized, which sucks because I had this massive and beautiful Anubias over here. They're all really hungry. You can see them chasing my hands. And my micros got a little out of whack, and it started melting back, and I'm still in some recovery phase. Like, even my crypts have been losing some leaves, which can happen season to season, but whatever. So what I'm trying to say is, this happens to the best of us. Don't freak out. But my thought here is that I think we've got enough aggressive growers consuming those micros to a point of where the Anubias is starting to miss some of those trace elements it needs. And that's why we're seeing that dieback occur and affecting the rhizome most importantly. So if we can get that and maybe get a little extra carbon source in there. I don't necessarily think you need to necessarily inject CO2, but maybe because it's not competing as much with some of the other plants, it'll have the ability to uptake some of the carbon that naturally occurs in your water and, do your water changes, all that kind of stuff, and make sure you have some kind of carbon source going in. Usually we get this through like fish poo, right? And from there, hopefully we can get it on the path of recovery. So Zach, I hope that helps you out. I want to start with that one. We'll make no other changes until then because this to me seems like the most glaring red flag. Just in looking at the pictures you've given me and the details you're giving me, I think this is our solution. And this would be the first course of action that I personally would take. I want to hear from everybody else in the comments down below. Have you dealt with a similar problem? How did you fix it? Were you unable to figure out the answer? Maybe you're dealing with this exact same problem with your Anubias right now and you're like, thank you. That helps me so much. I'm executing this exact same strategy. I want to know from you guys now. Comments down below. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a like. It is one of the absolute best ways to tell Papa YouTube, hey, I like this, and someone else might too. And if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing. We're going to do a whole series of these, and you have an opportunity to get my help directly. Just send me an email. There's all the details that you need to know in the video up in the corner right now. I'm here to help. So let me help. This has been Aquarium 911. As always, my friends, thank you so much for watching, and stay awesome.